right, and good morning. Sorry. Good morning or afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today, and welcome to today's C40 CCAC Waste webinar as part of our 2020 Global South Waste Program. Today's webinar is delivered in partnership also with Kabadiwalla Connect, and we have Sid from Kabadiwalla, who will be giving the word over to shortly. And today's presentation will be on increasing waste recycling through better informal sector data, which I know is a topic that many cities have increasingly been looking at, of sort of how to better harness the data and information produced at the very small level when it comes to the recovery of resources. As usual, we will have an initial presentation from the webinar presenter, and then we will have a Q&A session at the end. As usual, a few housekeeping rules. You can mute or unmute yourself using either your mouse if you're connected by a computer, or *9 if you're using your telephone to dial in. If you have any questions, either if you wish to speak them, please hold them until the end. Otherwise, you can type in questions in the chat box, which is at the center of your screen at the bottom, anytime. And without further ado, I think I'm going to get Sid. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to ask Sid to start sharing his screen. And in the meantime, feel free to just introduce yourself in the chat box if you wish. And I'm going to mute my mic, Sid, and over to you. I think you need to unmute your computer first.
Perfect, yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. Very excited to be here and present some work that we've been doing around the informal waste supply chain in India and Indonesia. So my background, just to start, I'm a data scientist by training. I worked with GIS and remote sensing. And I worked in the development sector for about 7 years before starting Kabadiwalla Connect. While I was working in the development sector, my primary role was really around the project management, around data collection, data visualization, creating the data pipeline for different projects within a particular organization. In 2015, I won a grant from the World Economic Forum, and it has then had a couple of follow-on financial kind of grants to map the informal waste supply chain in Chennai, India, where we actually started looking not just at waste pickers and their activities, but rather also who they sold to, these small scrap shops. They're known as Kabadiwallas in India, Lapaks in Indonesia. And we kind of mapped this entire supply chain. So through that, Kabadiwalla Connect was born, which is a for-profit business, a social enterprise that works to integrate the informal sector in cities in the developing world. And I'm very excited to be here. Thank you. So just to start, I would like to talk about just maybe setting some of the context. So waste generation is growing faster than any other environmental pollutant. It's actually one of these kind of complex development challenges. As a city becomes wealthier, has more economic activity, the waste increases and it becomes more complex, it becomes harder to manage. In some cases, it can even account to as much as 15% of the greenhouse gas emissions. In India, there is a serious problem with waste management, where urban India, our cities, generate about 70 million tons of waste every year. And currently, what the formal municipality collects, over 90% of that is actually going into landfills. It's actually a shame, because when you look at the composition of this waste, a large part of it, 50%, 60%, is actually organic and can be composted and can be harnessed to do something with. And a significant fraction is also recyclables, 20 to 25%, depending on the kind of city. It's very costly as well. There's a World Bank study which estimates that it can cost the municipality anywhere between 20 to 50% of their municipal budget. And if you look at India, you can see kind of as we have, are more kind of like the cities that have much more population, actually it's quite expensive. And it's a significant chunk of the municipal budget. There's also this issue around waste collection when concerns with small and medium waste generators. So when you typically look at trying to manage the waste stream of a larger generator of waste, so like a academic institution or an IT park or even a factory, there's actually enough volume at source for the unit economics for recycling to work. Whereas when you look at trying to collect material, recyclable material and organic material in a segregated, streamlined way from small and medium generators, households, shops, things like that, it gets quite complex. The issue of this overarching kind of problem with waste management with regards to how much it costs, how difficult it kind of is to set up, is actually one of these big symptoms that we have of plastic, of mismanaged plastic entering the waterways. And if you can see about over 8 million tons of waste that is going into the waterways, a large percentage of that is coming from Asia. And just to come back to this issue of the waste collection systems, it's not just a problem in India, but it's also a problem in the region, Southeast Asia, but as well as in Latin America. So I just want to start maybe quickly by describing how things work currently in India, at least the experience that we've had working in Indian cities. Typically, we tend to see this kind of ecosystem set up for the collection and management of waste. So the goal is you have bins or you have door-to-door collection to collect waste from waste generators, commercial, small and medium waste generators, things like that. From there, you have trucks taking it to transfer stations. At these transfer stations, there is some attempt at material recovery. And then depending on the kind of material, it's sent on its way. Now, this process of this flow is completely disrupted in India. And typically what we have is everything is towards the landfill. So there's actually very minimal kind of like work within the formal waste management system to actually recycle and guarantee high quality feedstock to processors. So we actually have a missing link between the municipal systems and the processing systems or the larger processors in a typical region. And it's in this gap where, as discussed, about 20 to 25% of the recyclable waste, that's a lot of material. And that's where the informal sector kind of comes in to pick up things of value and send it across on its way to processors. And Kabadiwalla Connect, we believe there's a unique opportunity to leverage this informal waste supply chain to develop decentralized integrated solid waste management systems in India and other places. I just want to maybe start by talking very quickly about some context about the informal sector. Currently, there's an ILO study that says 2 billion people, that's more than 61% of the world's employed population, work in the informal economy. And 93% of that informal employment is in emerging and in developing countries. Waste management is a classic example of this kind of supply chain, where you have 1.5 million waste pickers across the country, recovering a large volume of material. And there are also studies that actually say that this activity is helping save the municipality money. So there's a really interesting study which says that for every ton that the informal sector collects, it saves 25,000 rupees. So that's about $330 a ton. And there's also this one big problem of the most marginalized stakeholder, the waste pickers, actually earn very, very, very little given the amount of contribution that they provide in the recycling ecosystem. There's some really interesting studies as well about the informal sector, again, trying to push this idea of the benefits of integration. For example, in the role of informal sector and recycling and waste management in developing countries, authors David Wilson et al. Contend that there's a lot of folks depending on the recycling material, and the Western experience shows that it's very expensive to establish new formal recovery systems once existing informal ones have been allowed to decline or disappear. So there's actually this this dependence that we have. And COVID, you know, COVID times is actually something that's made that very visible, where the large processors have started to complain, saying, oh, you know, the waste pickers have not come back because of this long period of economic shutdown. And that's making things very complicated. And this is kind of the landscape that we entered into in 2015, where there was all of this literature around the benefits of informal sector integration, but there were very few pilots on ground, very few concrete examples of things that were really integrating the informal supply chain as a whole. And moreover, there was this misunderstanding or a lack of understanding of the entire informal waste supply chain. So just to give you an example of that, and I think that this is one of the biggest issues that we identified in 2015, that there was this lack of consensus on how the informal supply chain was defined. Most studies focused primarily on waste pickers and didn't really spend a lot of time on who they sold to, what happened across that supply chain, and what happened ultimately to that recycling material. So the two visualizations I have here, the first is it's called a wordle. So essentially, it's an interesting way to measure the repetition of words. So what we did was we took the 30 most cited papers around the informal sector in India, and we pushed it in there, and we wanted to look specifically at the words that they used to describe the actors in the informal sector. And you can see folks are describing collector or waste picker, item buyer, a wholesaler, a middleman. So this is a very clear example of we've not spent the time and done the homework of what do we say when we say the informal sector. We have all these assumptions and biases that kind of creep in. And we were very interested in 2015 on what is, if we were to look at how the supply chain functioned from an economics perspective, how could we develop our own heuristic and kind of add to the academic discussion around this issue of consensus. So this is where we started in 2015. We started mapping the informal sector in Chennai. It was funded by the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, the World Economic Forum, through a small grant, as I was a global shaper with them, and through an innovation grant from Expo Live, which is a grant giving organization from Expo 2020 in Dubai. We did it in Chennai, which is my hometown. It's the 4th largest city in India, and it's on the East Coast in South India. And we developed when we started looking at the data, we suggested our own heuristic. We said waste pickers, what we call level 0 aggregators, selling to level 1 aggregators, small scrap shops, who then in turn sell to level 2 aggregators, who then in turn sell to processors. Now, I just want to spend a quick minute to explain why the idea of levels and aggregation was critical to us, because when we looked at how the supply chain functioned, we realized that a lot of how they got paid or a lot of the work that they do is kind of contingent around how much they aggregate and what they do in the ecosystem. So aggregation was like a key element in thinking about how this supply chain worked. And again, so this was the focus area of our study. So a typical level 1 aggregator known as a Kabadiwalla shop in Chennai, Lapak in Indonesia, that's how they look. They locate themselves in residential areas or around landfills. They have anywhere between 5 to 10 waste pickers selling to them, or in some cases, they actually have direct relationships with small commercial establishments and other regions and other kind of waste generators in their neighborhood. They really are optimized to collect the material at source from where it's being generated, especially the residential located scrap shops. The largest scrap shops we found are actually outside in the city. They function more like material recovery facilities. They're much more specialized in what they do. They really try to be the kind of first level of pre-processing from a processor's, from the recycler's perspective. And so we mapped 2,000 small scrap shops. So we found 2,000 small scrap shops in the city, all over, densely located in pretty much every neighborhood in the city. They were sourcing around 130,000 tons of material annually. They all had feature phones. 50% of them had smartphones. And here was a key distinction as well. So they were not at the same economic bracket as a waste picker. They were more like what an Uber driver is making. They actually are, they're entrepreneurs. They have a lot of stickiness and social capital. And the other interesting fact was when we asked them, would you be interested in doing household or door-to-door collection on behalf of the municipality? 75% of them said yes, we would love to do that. We'd be interested in having that conversation. It's about the money and it's about making it worth my while. When we look at the level 2 aggregators, very different. 70% of them were specialized, looking at only one material, either paper, plastic, glass, or metal. They had about 7 to 10 employees. On the other hand, the scrap shops actually had 1 or 2 employees. They were doing much more volume. So on average, they were doing 36 tons. The storage capacity was 36 tons. And they were doing much more revenue, $10,000, $12,000. So this was in the more bracket of the material recovery facilities that we can think about. But I think the key number that what really fascinated me in 2015 was this 130,000 tons of recyclables, saved from landfills or diverted from landfills every year through their activity. And I think that was a fascinating number because typically when folks talk about waste picker integration, it's always, oh, it's a high touch thing for us. It's high cost. How do we do this? But what the supply chain is kind of showing when you look at it on a map is that this is infrastructure that can be leveraged, that can be retrofitted for the purpose of better waste management in the city. Just to illustrate that point, we made a quick video, which I'll hopefully play for you, and I hope it's audible. Is that okay?
We can't hear. Last time you'd put your headphones near the mic or something.
All right.
Now we can hear music.
Problem for urban India. Still can't hear me? Still can't hear the video?
No, now it seems to have frozen.
Currently, our cities generate close to
now we can hear
waste every year, and over 90% of what the municipality collects is sent to the landfill. In Chennai, for example, we generate close to 5,000 tons of waste every day, and all of that material gets sent to our landfills in Palikarnai and Kudingallur. Now, this is a shame because technically about 50% of the waste that gets generated daily is compostable, and another 15 to 20% is actually recyclable material. Now, if we examine why so much waste is being sent to the landfill, it really comes down to 2 big issues. The first is that it is a huge challenge for the municipality to implement proper segregation at source, especially with regards to your small and medium waste generators like your households, apartments, and small businesses. So the second problem is that it remains a very expensive process for the municipality to organize collection of segregated material at the neighborhood level. So in this gap, where the formal waste management system really focuses on the disposal of waste to the landfill, there exists this amazing shadow supply chain of stakeholders really incentivized to source back recyclable material in the city. Termed somewhat ambiguously as the informal sector, it consists of waste pickers or level 0 aggregators who roam the streets searching for recyclable material that they think they can sell. They sell this material to a level 1 aggregator called Kabadiwallas in India, who buy this material and segregate it into purer waste streams and aggregate higher volumes in their shop. These level 1 aggregators are usually found in or are in very close proximity to residential areas, which allow waste pickers to find them easily, but also allow waste generators to find them easily. So these Kabadiwallas then sell their material to a level 2 aggregator, who are usually found much further away from the city. These level 2 aggregators who buy much higher volumes are more specialized in what they do and typically do some basic processing to the recyclable material that they buy. Now, this informal supply chain, which is actually optimized to recycle, is currently completely invisible. making it very hard for the formal waste management ecosystem to work with them efficiently. To make matters worse, the most marginalized stakeholders in the informal supply chain typically assume most of the risk when dealing with the city's recyclable waste, especially with regards to health and safety. I feel that if cities in the developing world are to be model cases for resource recovery and recycling in the future, then the informal sector has to play a critical role. It cannot be any other way. As the world looks to implement circular economy principles in the global south, as well as find solutions that plug the leak of plastic into our oceans, it is very important to work in ways that ensure the lives of all stakeholders in the informal sector improve.
So I, so I hope that was audible, and you can hear me okay now. So like I said, I want to deep dive a little bit into the work that we did mapping this informal supply chain. So the methodology that we wanted to have was a street by street survey of small scrap shops, because we realized that there was actually nowhere else to collect this data apart from going on the ground and approaching it in a really rigorous, robust census style of assessment and mapping. We looked at a series of different data sets, one around the demographics, second around business activities, the material flow, and a host of other elements around finance and how it worked. And the other element, of course, was to build a digital map. So an interactive portal where you could kind of now look and explore that data and have it make sense. So one of the key things, of course, to do the mapping, and we developed like solid standard operating procedures so we could train our surveyors. We had a whole bunch of technology actually built around open source tools that help with our data collection pipeline, and to make sure that the data was collected in a very robust and quick way. And then we had a similar pipeline on the data analysis. And what was really exciting for us was when we were figuring out our methodology, the first 200 data points mapping scrap shops took around a month to collect. The final 200 data points in our survey took actually a week to collect. So it's really something that we believe supports like a rapid assessment style. This is something that cities can do quite quickly. We believe that anywhere between 3 to 6 months is enough to actually build a very contextual baseline of solid waste management for policymakers and managers of waste in that region. I want to talk a little bit more about this heuristic that we developed, level 0, level 1, and level 2. Now, one of the key elements that we saw, and this is actually looking, and we were very excited when we saw a very similar supply chain set up in Indonesia. One of the key elements about the level 0 and level 1 relationship, the Kabadiwalla waste picker relationship, is that at its heart, it's actually material agnostic. Kabadiwallas buy paper, plastic, glass, and metal. Their core money is actually coming from paper and metal. And plastic is this kind of new game. So what we have actually seen is that if you come in and send the right signal into their marketplace, they're willing to pick up really what you want. So the quality of material that you can get through this supply chain and the kind of work that they've set up is around being material agnostic. So integrating them into a collection solution, municipal waste collection solution, into maybe a more informal type of supply chain is something that they're very attuned and aligned with. When you look at the level 2, it's much more specialized. So, they will do some kind of baling, grinding kind of work, much larger shop. These are really the material recovery facilities of the informal supply chain. And again, you need to think about them in a particular way to have success in integrating them into the formal system. One of the key issues that it typically has is there is this kind of misunderstanding on their role and the value proposition that you need to provide to these different stakeholders. And for us, when you think about it as level 0, level 1, and level 2, it kind of, there are tools that you can develop and kind of like bubbles that you can build around this together. So for example, we found that a really interesting way to get a level 2 aggregator to work with us and actually digitalize their entire material flow, is to just support them and help them build compliance in their shop. Just basically make it a small compliant factory and connect them, and so that they can have a stable contract with the processor. And that was enough to get them to say, yeah, I'm excited to do digitalization. When it comes to the level 1 aggregator, it's a fascinating relationship where they're actually ready to collect more if you can provide the right value proposition, which is essentially money, stable incomes, you know, those kinds of things. So I think that is very, very fascinating for us. I just maybe also want to highlight one story that was very, for us, like a very important story during COVID times. So essentially, because of the economic shutdown, so the recycling industry in India, you know, it really works on this need to be interstate transport, to have interstate transport, because a lot of the material from Chennai will go to a different state to be processed, et cetera, et cetera. So when we had this lockdown, the recycling industry's activity was completely shut for a really long time. And waste pickers actually don't have any, you know, don't have any savings. How are they going to have food, et cetera, et cetera? So one of the things that we saw was at scale, Kabadiwalla is giving them enough money on a day-to-day basis so that they could go to the public. You know, we have it's called an Amma canteen. It's like a public canteen, very cheap food. And it was just the right amount so that they could get 3 meals over there. And essentially they were saying, okay, if you can pick up some kind of plastic, please do pick it up. You know, leave it outside my shop. We can do we can do the calculation later. It's a very sticky relationship because these guys want their waste pickers to stay. The other thing is that these guys have those reserves to be able to pay and take all of these kinds of hits and things like that. So I think that when you think about like who really supported waste pickers during the COVID time, it's not really, you know, the role of the Kabadiwalla is missing out of the narrative about how they are supporting, and a lot more work needs to be done to kind of support this informal supply chain. I just want to take a stab at trying to think about a roadmap for formalization, because typically when people talk about formalization, they mean get a business license, you know, and pay tax and things like that. But, you know, when you think about informality, you need to be very, you need to really think about it as from a very kind of humanistic point of view. How can you build health and safety protocols first? How can you you know, improve the livelihoods first, and then what does formalization really mean? And again, I think that our heuristic is a pretty interesting kind of like a marker to think about formalization activities. So for example, the material recovery facilities, the level 2 aggregators, they're a prime candidate to be formalized. And one kind of big carrot could be for them to do some kind of decentralized processing on behalf of the city and things like that. When you look at the waste pickers, I mean, the first thing is to get them out of this bad condition of how they pick up material, and which is really one of the key issues that needs to be solved. And again, there better integration around collection can really support. So we really think that we need to think about it as steps. The first is enumeration, that's absolutely key. Then there is social protection, site compliance, digitalization, and then finally a dignified integrated collection service. I just want to end just doing this assessment, just how important this data is in terms of a policymaker's approach to, you know, deciding the right strategy for a particular area. So now in India and in Chennai, the Chennai municipality, we have 200 wards. The ward is the unit at which the waste management infrastructure assessments are done. So depending on each ward, the right kind of assessment for what is required for that ward needs to be met. So we've taken Ward 100 as an example. It's one ward in Chennai. It has a population of 45,000 people, and there are 185 streets. So at least in India, a lot of the waste collection is all around coverage of these streets. So you agree on which are the streets and the service area, and then you have to report back on the service area coverage of these streets. So there are 185 streets there. Overall, the ward generates close to 40 tons of waste. And the municipality currently collects 37 tons. So there's only a 2-ton kind of service coverage shortage, if you can see. Now, when you look at the breakup, wet waste is about 19 metric tons, so the largest fraction. You have about 2 metric tons of paper, 3 metric tons of plastic, some glass, metal, and then of course you have your hazardous and inerts. When you look at the formal infrastructure, you know, we went and did an assessment in that ward. there were 8 battery operated vehicles that had a capacity of 3 tons per trip, which is about 23. But overall, when you look at, we have about 36 tricycles, which are doing the other 77%. And then you have these corporation bins, 61 for 45,000 people. We didn't know how to map the exact operating capacity, but there's a gap there. There's a gap in, it's all unsegregated mixed waste. But we have invested in, this ward has invested in organic infrastructure. There are 2 micro composting centers that have a capacity of 6 tons a day. There's some well ring composting. There's actually a biogas plant. There's some mulch pits. And then, of course, for waste transportation, you have some high motor vehicles and things like that. Now, so that's what typically the data set that a manager would be given with this waste generation pattern, and say, okay, what was your strategy? But now let's add the dimension of the informal sector. So now in the informal sector, there are about 160 waste pickers in that ward. They're collecting about 5 metric tons of material every day. And they're actually not operating at full capacity. They're only operating sub 40% of the amount capacity that they actually have for collection. There are about 16 small scrap shops who each have a capacity of 15 metric tons per day, and they're operating only at 13% capacity right now. Now, let's do the assessments. So we can see, and again, this, you can see again with this data that segregation is a key issue. Even though there are 12 metric tons day of processing capacity, it's only recycling 7 tons. And then there's of course this gap for the other amount of volume. Recyclable waste treatment, not great at all. These 2 metric tons are actually being collected in the most suboptimal way possible, where people are mixing things, throwing it into these 61 bins. Waste pickers are coming in, trying to find what they can, and then selling it to their small scrap shop. And again, the informal sector storage utilization is not being utilized at all. So building a waste management strategy for Ward 100 without informal sector data, this is just a hypothesis, would look something like this. Let's hire 78 municipal staff and tricycles to handle door-to-door collection of waste. We need to hire 8 supervisors to ensure proper scheduling and monitoring of day-to-day collection activities. With the organic and wet waste component, that it is collected by door-to-door collection by the 78 municipal staff and deposited in micro composting centers. Let's build 4 micro composting centers where the wet waste will be further segregated and processed into compost. And about 85 tons of compost is generated monthly, which can be sold to the municipality. Now, let's take the dry waste component. Dry waste will be collected by the same staff, 78, and bring it to the resource recovery center. So this is separate from the organic waste center. And then we would build 2 resource recovery centers that can handle this, and hire 20 staff. And then if we digitalize these 2 resource centers, we can handle all the dry recyclable waste. And of course, the inert fraction, the municipal staff are taking it back to the transfer station, where it's either incinerated or landfill. Now, with informal sector data, we'd start on a very different point. Let's hire 78 waste pickers, 50% of the waste pickers that are in that ward, to handle this door-to-door collection. Let's integrate 8 small scrap shops who will basically do the overall supervision of this waste collection and waste management activity on behalf of the municipality. When you look at the organic waste, it's very simple. These waste pickers and the scrap shops are making sure that the organic fraction is going to the micro composting center. So this is where the informal and formal are kind of integrating. With regards to the dry recyclable waste, let's use their own storage capacity and work with their team to segregate it even further, before then selling it to these larger scrap shops who will then sell it to the processors. Let's take advantage of that network and actually build compliance in that supply chain to push the recyclable fraction into the infrastructure that supply chain has. And then of course the inerts would be handled a different way. So this is kind of just a data-driven kind of like thought experiment on how we would design strategies. But again, the data is so critical and the heuristics are so critical. I just want to go back to where we are today, which is all of us as managers and policymakers and even funders, we're at this point where we're not recognizing that there is a fundamental issue around classification. And this is a dangerous proposition for people who are invisible in the informal supply chain. So yeah, that's my time, everyone. I hope that this kind of made sense. I really look forward to some comments and interaction.
Thank you very much, Sid. That was a lot of very Very useful content, which I certainly found very interesting. Thank you very much. I see that there are already a couple of questions typed in the chat box. Keep them coming if you prefer to write them, or feel free to mute and unmute your computer. Just before we start on the questions, I just wanted to highlight how, from a sort of municipal perspective, this type of data can really make a difference to the work we do every day. Sid just mentioned that the informal sector in Chennai recovers about 130,000 tons of waste every year, which works out to somewhere around 400 tons per day. And Chennai produces a total of 5,000 tons per day. So this means that just by looking at the informal waste recyclers included in Sid's model, Chennai actually has a diversion rate, a recycling rate of almost 10%, because they are now able to establish that they are diverting 400 tons of recyclables from the landfill every day, which is almost 10% of the waste that they produce, which is quite a fantastic piece of data to be able to have. I am going to start with the questions. I see a question from Alfonso from Cape Town, looking more at the legislation. So Alfonso asks Sid, what legislation enables the informal sector to thrive? And feel free to use examples from Chennai, or I can, we have then other examples from other places.
Sure. I mean, it's a very tough question. And it's a side of big study. You know, and I think we have to start with this fact that so much of the work is actually informal. I mean, I think that there's a very structural issue of you know, why so many people are just out of this formal work condition and formal work ecosystem. At a very basic level, I think when it comes to waste management, the formal system has been doing something that's very expensive and very you know, really focused on disposal and collection elements. And because there's value in this material, this informal supply chain has developed over time. So it developed at least in Chennai's case, you know, the first waste, we asked questions on when they set up. The oldest scrap shop was working in the business for 65 years. So that means somewhere 50, 60 years ago, people realized that this was a business and set it up. The other thing that was really fascinating when we looked at scrap shops and their hometowns in Chennai, we found that 45% or something like that number can be traced back to from one geographical location, one town in the state. So that means somebody had come to Chennai a while ago and found this work opportunity and had been calling people from his town to come and support and set up. So these are things that have happened because of market demand and the value of recyclable materials. And I think for us, when we think about informal sector integration, we really need to start with the health, safety, and equity component first. And then we need to think about how will the law respond to that? Because right now you have a situation where there's something happening for the last 50 years. And I think the legislation now is not at a point where it's responding to that. In fact, it's kind of turning a blind eye in some way. I mean, I always ask the question, you know, why were we the first to map this kind of supply chain? You know what I mean? Like where are the folks asking these questions when, especially it's a lived experience, you know, it's a lived experience every day for me for my local scrap shop to be buying and selling material. Where is the knowledge around this that's coming from the grassroots? And I think that that's an overall problem. And especially when you look at waste management, you have this kind of like, oh, what's the Western countries or the Western cities doing? Let's try to copy that. Let's try to invest in those kinds of things. And I think that is a problem. It's kind of all come to head right now. If that makes sense.
Thank you very much, Sid, for the experience in Chennai. In more general terms, and this is of course one of the key questions, because most of the people on this webinar are waste managers, whereas informal sector integration is a discipline that, well, obviously involves waste management, but then it involves policy development, so the legal component, it involves social services. So it's really an area where as a pure waste manager, you are also working in other sectors. And from a policy perspective, the majority of cities that C40 has worked with started with a formalization process. So this means officially registering a number of waste pickers that have actually shown to be interested in the project. So what some cities have done is they identified, for example, a low-income area of the city where waste collection was particularly challenging, and they set out a call. They said, we will register 1,000 waste pickers. For some reason, 1,000 seems to be the number that cities start with. And they register 1,000 people. Now, by registering, and this can be a challenge, of course, because we've seen in many cases these are undocumented illegal immigrants. So, of course, the registration process, if they don't have documents, can be a little more challenging. But essentially, what we are doing there is we are recognizing them as official players in the waste management system. I think, Sid, also in Chennai, you have issues with access to waste, that the waste picker collects waste and then it's taken from the waste company. So within this recognition, within this process of registration of the waste picker, you are entitling them to keeping the waste that they are collecting. You are generally giving them a sorting space where to sort their recyclables, because otherwise you end up with burning and dumping and all of that. So generally an area where they can sort their waste. And generally within this registration and recognition, there is the ability to then charge a nominal fee when they collect waste door to door. And it's all included in policies that are written, or one policy that is written by from the city. And really, we've noticed that this type of policies sets the city then on a path towards improved integration, which then evolves to social protection and the establishment of cooperatives from individual groups like we've seen in Latin America.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a really important move. I guess my response to this in this context would be, we need to agree on some kind of integration strategy for the small scrap shops and the large scrap shop. The idea of enumeration, I think, is key, and recognition is absolutely key. But what we fail to do is kind of really take advantage of the scale of the supply chain by just looking at the waste picker component. So, for example, a lot of these programs are kind of instituted right at landfills, where the problem is waste pickers are going into the landfills and picking up material. But there's also a lot of waste pickers who are going into the bins and then selling into the scrap shops. And you have these scrap shops either around the landfill or around residential neighborhoods. So again, depending on where you are, you really need to look at the right kind of integration strategy. And we need something for small scrap shops that are in the city that are serving a core function, that are outside the landfill that are still serving a core function. So it's almost a question of like upgrading and like capacity building, saying, okay, we have these 1,000 waste pickers, and then we now have these 30 scrap shops who are working with these waste pickers, and we have the right tools. Like digitalization, for example, is an amazing tool to see and check the behavior between vendors in your supply chain. So we, for example, Kabadiwalla Connect, we've been piloting these point of sale devices, which are essentially like, you capture all business activities in the small scrap shop. And that gives you a strong visibility on who's the waste picker coming in, what volume, how much did he get paid? Did he get paid or she get paid a good rate, things like that. But yeah, my feeling would be, we need to do something for the smaller and larger scrap shops. Smaller scrap shops, they are intrinsically tied to waste pickers. They would not, these two are partners in this job. We need to recognize the second partner. And then you have these larger scrap shops who are material recovery facilities that actually can be integrated almost immediately before you need to pay for new infrastructure.
Thank you very much. That is a very, very valid point. The recognition and registration process should not just apply to the waste picker, but also to the smaller and potentially the larger aggregators. But I think we can agree that sort of the registration of the players, of their participation in waste operations is probably the first step that we've seen in the majority of cities. So moving on, always to South Africa, we move to Tshwane. Louis is asking a question. Do you find that there is a resistance from the informal sector to cooperate with municipalities because they see government as bringing punitive legislative interventions and not much support? In South Africa, they have a very different context from India sometimes.
No, I mean, I think that, you know, we've seen two kinds of behaviors. So for example, during COVID, the scrap shops were almost the last shops to open because they're of their informal status. The police were able to put a lot of pressure on them to stay closed, and they struggled to come together and say, hey, we had open. So they were one of the last shops to open. And they work, you know, of course they operate in a yeah, there of course is a small umbrella of fear. You know, the police, when you're taking a truck, you have to stop. A police guy will ask you for a little bit of money on your way. At least this is the Indian experience. But overall, I think that they're quite happy to be able to operate, and they kind of understand that they are very valuable to the municipality. So for example, one of the things, and we've had some interactions with the operators from Chennai, and one of the things is, you know, they're telling their own stuff, the formal system. So in the transfer stations, on the resource recovery centers, when their conservancy officers are going out to collect material, they've been told that, you know, on your way, take your recyclables, sell it, and make money yourselves on your way back to the formal station, so you can make some money. So because they see it again as cost saving, I can maybe pay a little bit less, and, you know, they're going to make some money off recyclables. So there's so many again, it's a common sight to see a municipal worker with, you know, the municipal badge and everything, stopping on his way to a Kabadiwalla shop, selling the recyclables, and then heading to the transfer station. So again, it's very context specific. There's definitely will be resistance to, you know, getting a license if there's not a clear value proposition attached. I think something like a license, you know, is a very, you know, it has to come with a package of things. And if it doesn't come with that, if we don't take into consideration the value proposition, we will always find these abrasive points. But then there are also a lot of points of like collaboration that we can look and exploit.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sid. The next question is from Fanja, from Antananarivo, Madagascar, who talks more about the procedure or process to work between municipality and the informal waste pickers. I know that we've touched on legislation already, but would you like to talk a little more about process, maybe?
Yeah, you know, this is something that honestly, it's an open question for us. You know, I do think that enumeration is a very, very important starting point for getting the informal sector to work with the municipality. But for us, I mean, I think that one of the things that we have to do first, or what we are focusing on, is trying to build consensus around the classification. Because when we have some consensus on classification, it's the right starting point to talk about something. Right now we have this perspective. So just as an example, you know, we had extended producer responsibility draft guidelines for plastic that came out in India. And there is this problem of informal sector classification there that makes it very hard to say, okay, what does this actually mean for this person or this person? Because we just don't have any common language on what this person is or what that person does. Are they an assembler, for example? You know, it's something that's very problematic at the heart of any issue around this topic about the procedural, you know, how to build a process between the informal and formal, if that makes any sense.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sid. We move over to Unati, who is asking what kind of support is provided to the informal sector to ensure that they come on board or cooperate, and please specify who is providing this support, because obviously a lot of the people who dial in are talking from a city perspective here.
I think that one of the biggest supports for waste pickers is the small scrap shop. So again, there's, you know, the city, what support is the city doing? Is that the question? What support is the city providing the informal sector to ensure they come on board?
to promote that, what kind of incentives were provided to the informal sector in general to promote their adhesion, their participation in the project?
Yeah. So again, I think just coming from one thing from India's perspective on the government side of things, I think that the one thing was very, very interesting is we have a national skill development mission, which is this kind of like central funded scheme for upskilling folks. And the heuristic of a waste picker was included, which allowed a lot of NGOs to come in and access skilling money and then work with waste pickers. So that was something that was very, 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 very cool, and has led to a lot of kind of like support for waste pickers, you know, in terms of supporting them with health and safety gear, a bunch of these kinds of things. I think that if that kind of support, this idea of skilling or retrofitting and integrating into these other kind of government schemes, I think that that would be very fascinating for, you know, imagine a small scrap shop package or a large scrap shop package. But I think that that's something I can think about for India's example, about the government really coming in and providing some kind of layer of support.
Thank you. We have a question from Anita from London, who thanks you for a very clear and interesting presentation. It's clear that recognizing and uplifting the most vulnerable, the invisible collectors, can be done in a way that benefits the collectors and municipalities. This is not, it's more of a comment. I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, I mean, I'm just reading the other comment where we're talking about the formalization often requires registration of people who perhaps need to remain invisible if they are illegal immigrants. Yes, the police use this vulnerability to elicit cash bribes. How do we give the collectors' job safety without compromising their identity? Perhaps a change in government stance on refugees. That's a tough, you know, that's a tough question for me to. I definitely think that data abstraction is a key role. You know, you need to know some things, but what are the things that are visible, I think is absolutely critical. I don't, you know, for example, like when we did our survey, there's an embedded caste hierarchy in waste management, right? And we decided that, you know, we would treat that data on a much more different scale than thinking about their business activities and all of these kinds of things. So I think that data collection around their strengths and building evidence on that is a very positive thing. But then collecting data on status or you know, those kinds, we need the right kind of sieve to make this data valuable and make it, you know, not make, you know, the people shouldn't be vulnerable at the end of this exercise.
Yeah, thanks, Sid. It's Anita. Yeah, that's so interesting. And exactly as you say, it's what data you're collecting, and it's the data that's really useful, as opposed to focusing on the data that isn't useful, what cost, etc. Thank you. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you, Anita. Louis from Chuane is asking if you would be able to share some insight on the study you mentioned, which shows informal sector saves municipality money. If you have any articles. I know I have one definitely on Accra that talks about the actual financial savings of working with the informal sector. Do you have any others you could share, Sid?
Sure. I mean, I'll just share my presentation. So we have the links for some of the comments. And what we've also done is we've taken the 30 top cited papers. So that's actually mapped to a Google Doc. So there's a lot of resources in there that have these numbers and attribute, you know, it's all data attributed, I think.
We'll send that to you then, Louis. Good to see you. Good to see you and hear from you. Alfonso from Cape Town in South Africa, our government has developed a waste picker integration guideline. This is not law, but it does allow a legal framework in guiding municipalities and PROs to work together to integrate waste pickers. This is a different approach, which is interesting. The sort of overall guidelines are published at the national level, and then policies and projects are implemented ad hoc. Differ individually in each city with differences.
No, that's fascinating, and I think again, like, you know, when we think about the opportunity for the informal sector integration, I think that this whole focus on plastics, especially low value plastics, and PROs and, you know, industry funded organizations coming around is is a great opportunity for us to try to do something that really recognizes. It's almost like we're at a flashpoint now, where there are going to be some big decisions made around the way things set up, the KPIs around certification, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the things for us is we're really trying to publicize this idea of how the supply chain functions, level 1, level 2, level 0, just because it's important that, we really feel that if you can come in with the right value proposition for the small scrap shop and the large scrap shop, then you're going to see some very innovative kinds of approaches to waste management that's just inherently more decentralized. And we really hope that people take that opportunity, like that there is some pilots out there that do this and that comes out. I think it's really pilot time. So can we, for us at Kabadiwalla Connect, we are trying to say, okay, can we take 50 streets over from the municipality with these scrap shops and collect the data for 2 years so that we can show people, hey, you can trust a waste picker. He's going to work very hard for you. Like you can trust these guys to take over this really key city component and work with them in the long term. So there's this element of de-risking that also needs to happen. So I think just municipalities, if they're open and kind of like looking at the different folks that are out there doing things and just coming in and saying, okay, work with this kind of thing. I think that's also really, really important.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And Unati, to your last comment, we have a lot of studies on the integration of waste pickers, how other countries are succeeding on this. So if you can provide an email or reach out later on, we'd be happy to have a further conversation on this. You'd gone back to Anita's second comment, Sid, already, or would you like to add anything on how do we give the collectors job safety without compromising their identity?
No, I think that, it's just about thinking about what data you want to represent and to whom. Just using that example about like, if we had collected caste data and then published that would have set a lot of wrong signals. Really what we focused on was their economic activity, and the data will tell a story, but the narrative comes from how we approach it. So I think that if we approach it from a perspective of they're valuable, they're kind of doing so much, they're creating so much value for the city, and focus on what data supports that aspect, then we can kind of like find the right path.
Great. Thank you very much, Sid. And yes, from our perspective, C40, we're seeing some incredible benefits in just improving integration with the informal sector. We are seeing particular benefits in improving collection and recycling in low-income areas as an alternative to the delivery of municipal services. And in most of our low-income areas across our cities, there's little road access, no bins. The local households are not in a position to pay the very high fees of the big waste companies and big waste trucks need to charge, because they use a lot of diesel. So if you try to localize that management of the waste, if you actually try to recover as much of it locally as you can, and then this works very well with the informal sector, you're actually able to provide an alternative service to the low-income area at a much, much cheaper price. Because the waste collectors there, they use hand carts or very simple motorized carts rather than big equipment that needs to be maintained and is expensive.
Yeah, no, I think that when we were doing one estimation, so if you got the waste pickers and scrap shops to do last mile collection through their tricycles, then you're eliminating the diesel cost for that last mile collection, which turns out to be I think it's something like 80 crores for Chennai, which is, I think 1 million is 7 crores. So it's about
10 million.
12 million dollars a year, I think.
Transportation across our cities, transportation often accounts for up to 30–40% of overall waste management costs for a city, sometimes even more. So yeah. It makes a huge difference if you can treat the waste locally. It really saves the city money. And Alfonso, as a true politician, correctly says that unemployment and good for job creation, and this is a very good angle to always use when building a case internally within your cities, is the fact that every mayor can create 1,000 jobs, 2,000 jobs by formalizing the informal sector. Don't know if you want
Yeah,
to
and
say something on this, Alfonso.
no, I just wanted to mention, and thanks for the presentations, guys. But I wanted to mention is it's, you know, as a developing country and maybe even within India, there's unemployment, there's a lot of other social issues, and often when it comes to waste speaker integration, you have to, and I think you mentioned it earlier, that you have to work closely with other departments within your municipality, like your social department, your economic department, because there's other elements that waste, you know, as a waste manager or a waste specialist, you cannot tackle by yourself. So it's often, you're often required to really step out of your comfort in networking and, you know, getting to the grassroots level in really addressing the needs. And it's not just waste management, you know, which is your focus perhaps, but there's other needs. There's, you know, some people are hungry, some people are unemployed. And so it's real life challenges that needs a different kind of mentality and thinking and approach. Yeah.
You are absolutely correct, and having cities work together is as important from the city perspective as it is from the C40 perspective. It's funny because even at C40 we have the same challenge of different teams from different disciplines working together. I can imagine that also from a municipal perspective.
Awesome. Yes.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Alfonso.
Thank you guys.
Thank you. I don't know if there are any other questions or comments for Sid. We are just a few minutes over our meeting time. Otherwise, I would just like to clarify that we have another webinar later today, but it will be the same webinar. So it's just for the different time zones to give our colleagues, our friends from Latin America and our friends from Africa to have a better session, but we don't expect anyone from Asia to connect in like 4 hours, 5 hours time. So thank you very much everyone for
Thank you. And I think, will you share the presentation with us and some of the contact details that you mentioned earlier or some studies?
Sure, Alfonso, absolutely. We have everything available online, but I'll send it to you.
Okay, so I'll just leave my email address in the comment section.
Yes, please.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. That was really fun. Please stay in touch, and if you want to ask us more about our work, happy to set some time up. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.